Who's the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court? My guess is that most Americans would answer Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's so famous now that she's often referred to by just her initials, RBG. Elevated to the High Court by President Bill Clinton in 1993, the left-leaning Justice Ginsburg was the subject of not one, but two movies in 2018 alone. But she isn't the first female Supreme Court justice. She's the second. The first doesn't have a movie named after her. That's because Sandra Day O'Connor was appointed by a Republican president, Ronald Reagan. We hear a lot about the Year of the Woman, the Women's March, and the war against women. But if the major media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, CBS, and others, were more interested in accuracy than advocacy, it would be that they are promoting the Year of the Leftist Woman, or the Leftist Women's March. The major media like to pretend that all women think alike and that conservative women are just the exception that proves the rule. But according to a 2018 Pew Research study, about a third of women are Democrats, a little less than a third are Republican, and a little more than a third are independents. So if there are all these conservative women around, how does the media make it seem like they barely exist? They use three strategies. The first is omission. If you don't see something, you don't have to deal with it. Open up a glossy magazine. Every liberal woman is glamorized, stylishly dressed, beautifully photographed. Their personal stories are almost always an inspirational version of Joan of Arc. They have overcome overwhelming obstacles to make the world a more compassionate and tolerant place. Glamour magazine recognized 11 Democrat women among their 2018 Women of the Year. No Republican made the cut. First Lady Michelle Obama was on the cover of Vogue 3 times. First Lady and former fashion model Melania Trump? So far, not once. Every now and again, the major media will do a story about a female conservative to balance things out. But let's be honest, it's not balance, it's tokenism. The second strategy the media uses to diminish conservative women is mocking. Making fun of a woman's appearance discounts what she says. You would think the major media would resist this kind of objectification, but they don't, not if the target is a conservative woman. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the White House press secretary, and Kellyanne Conway, the first woman to run a winning presidential campaign, are routinely belittled for their hair, their eye makeup, or their weight. Their significant accomplishments, in contrast, are rarely acknowledged. Why? Because the media doesn't like their boss, and it treats women who work for him as traitors to their sex. The third strategy the media uses to demean conservative women is labeling. Using stereotypes precludes there being a valid reason for conservative women to hold the positions they do. The major media simply can't accept that conservatives have serious and important reasons for their beliefs, so they have to come up with answers to explain this seeming anomaly to themselves. These women must be racist or self-hating or just weak-minded. Here's how Barbara Streisand put it to the Daily Mail in England. A lot of women vote the way their husbands vote. They don't believe enough in their own thoughts. Labeling, like the strategies of mocking or omission, is just another way to display contempt and demonize conservative women. Its purpose is to persuade you to not treat those being labeled with respect, to ignore their ideas, and to even avoid associating with them. Not surprisingly, the vilification that results discourages a lot of conservative-leaning women from running for political office, or even from speaking up. Who needs that grief? It takes a strong person to swim against the media tide. But here's the thing about swimming against the tide. It makes you stronger. Maybe that's why Nikki Haley can stand up in the UN and tell the truth, or why Candace Owens can question the devotion to progressive policies that have so hurt blacks, or Ayaan Hirsi Ali can take on the cause of truly oppressed women, those living in radical Islamist societies. We need these voices and more like them. That's why it's so important to encourage a more respectful, inclusive debate. We should want everyone at the table, both sides of the political spectrum, listening with civility. That way we can be better informed and make better decisions. So if you hold conservative views, you have a particularly important role to play. You need to speak out to your friends, your family, and your coworkers. Let them hear your thinking and then let them make up their own minds. The media may pretend you don't exist. They may even mock or label you. They want to intimidate you into silence. That's not fair, and that's not right. Don't let them. I'm Heather Higgins, chairman of Independent Women's Forum for Prager University.
The most influential news source in the world is the New York Times. Every day, hundreds of newspapers and TV and cable news stations around the world follow its lead, literally. Why wouldn't they? Isn't the Times the gold standard of journalism, the place where the facts of the story are presented without bias or agenda? Actually, the answer is no. When it comes to episodes of major historical significance, the New York Times has routinely failed to provide the public with unbiased journalism. Instead, it has chosen to manufacture false narratives, often with catastrophic consequences. It has done this in service of its own financial and ideological interests. This goes back at least to 1932. That year, there was a terrible famine in the Ukraine. Between 5 and 7 million Ukrainians starved to death. The disaster had nothing to do with bad weather and everything to do with the ruthless regime of the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. Walter Duranty, the Times foreign correspondent in Moscow, knew all of this and covered it up. In fact, his reports flatly denied there was any famine at all. The American media took its lead from the Times star reporter. So did America's political elite, including newly elected President Franklin Roosevelt, who personally met with Duranty to discuss the situation in the Soviet Union. Duranty had another admirer, Joseph Stalin. The brutal tyrant had nothing but praise for the New York Times man. "You've done a good job in your reporting of the USSR because you tried to tell the truth about our country." Had Duranty exposed the facts about Stalin and the famine, the American people would have better understood the true nature of the Soviet Union. Instead, many were fooled. When it came to reporting on the persecution of Jews in Germany leading up to World War II, the Times was even worse. Initially, the paper refused to publish reports on the concentration camps. And when it finally did, those reports were relegated to the back pages. Again, the Times set the tone for the rest of the American media. If the Times didn't think the genocide of the Jews was a major story, it must not be one. In 1957, the Times flipped this script. It took a minor story, a rebellion in Cuba, and turned it into a major one. In the process, it helped destroy an entire country. New York Times reporter Herbert Matthews tracked down an all-but defeated rebel named Fidel Castro at his mountain hideout. From this interview came a flurry of front-page New York Times articles hailing Castro as Cuba's democratic savior. The Times transformed the down-and-out Marxist revolutionary into an international sensation. It is not an exaggeration to say that the Times made Castro. Without its assistance, the Cuban Revolution would have almost certainly failed. A very similar phenomenon played out a few years later in Southeast Asia. This time, instead of making a hero out of a villain, the Times made a villain out of a hero. With the paper's blessing, a brash young Times reporter, David Halberstam, decided that South Vietnamese elected leader Ngo Dinh Diem was a murderous madman. Caught up in the prevailing leftist notion that the American war effort was immoral and that the North Vietnamese communists were the real freedom fighters, Halberstam wrote piece after piece designed to bring down Diem. The one that did it was his reporting that the Diem government had massacred 30 Buddhist monks who were protesting Diem's policies. Only it didn't happen. Halberstam manufactured it out of whole cloth, basing it on anonymous sources and rumors. When a United Nations team later investigated the killings, they found that all the murdered Buddhists were alive and well. By then, of course, the damage had been done. Diem was never able to restore his reputation. Not long thereafter, he was assassinated and his government collapsed. For all his flaws, Diem was a strong leader and was never effectively replaced. The war would grind on for 10 more years. Today, the New York Times is spreading what might be its most damaging lie yet, that America is rooted in slavery, not liberty. This is the theme behind its 1619 project. Historians across the board, from left to right, have debunked the report's core claims. But far from rectifying the situation, the Times has doubled down, lobbying school districts around the country to replace their history curricula with the 1619 Project's brazen slanders. I've only given you a few examples of the Times' egregious behavior. You'll find many more in my book, The Gray Lady Winked: How the New York Times' Misreporting, Distortions, and Fabrications Radically Alter History. The most influential newspaper in the world doesn't deserve your trust. That it pretends to be objective just adds to its dishonesty. The New York Times pursues its own agenda, not the truth. Time to get wise to it. I'm Ashley Rinsberg, investigative journalist for Prager University.
Liberal or conservative, male or female, young or old, Americans love to bash the news media. Once among the nation's most trusted institutions, the news media have fallen from grace. According to Gallup, even as recently as 2000, a majority of Americans trusted the press. By 2015, it had fallen to 40%, and lower than that, 36% among those 18 to 49. It's hard to see how this decline will be reversed. The industry has become politically polarized, and in the highly competitive age of multiple 24-hour cable news channels and the Internet, it's under severe financial pressure. And this compounds an even deeper problem: failing journalistic standards. In the 1950s, the media universe consisted mainly of a few national television broadcast networks and local TV and radio stations, most of which got much of their news from major wire services and the nation's large newspapers. Most journalists were committed to producing objective journalism, fact-based stories independent of the government and of political parties. A reporter's job was to report, not offer opinion or advocate. Presented with the facts, it was up to readers to make their own judgments about news events. Opinions were supposed to be confined to editorial and op-ed pages. That world no longer exists. This lack of objectivity and the decline of standards is one reason, though not the only one, why newspapers and news magazines are a declining industry. According to Pew Research, print revenue from newspaper sales has declined from $47 billion in 2006 to $16 billion in 2014. Digital sales haven't come close to making up the difference. Most papers have been forced to cut operating expenses, slash staff, and close bureaus, overseas in particular. Ironically, there are more stories than ever to cover, and fewer staff than ever to cover them. This lack of information from professional journalists has been filled by a new source: social media and the blogosphere. When the Iraq War, which I covered for the New York Times, began in 2003, there were roughly 100,000 bloggers. Only a few years later, there were an estimated 27 million. The Internet as a news source has obvious pluses and minuses. On the plus side is that information is spread widely and instantly. The minuses have to do with the fact that the quality of reporting varies dramatically. It's not easy to separate the wheat from the chaff. Furthermore, many sites, including mainstream sites, have abandoned traditional journalistic practices and standards in search of more and more eyeballs. Objectivity, once the gold standard of reporting, is now often seen as old-fashioned, a ratings loser. When success is measured mainly in terms of clicks, the outrageous beats the sober just about every time. Inserting opinion, even in the middle of a news story, is a way in which journalists can distinguish themselves. And in mainstream media outlets, those opinions overwhelmingly tend to be liberal. This might not be so bad if journalists acknowledged their bias, but they almost never do. Yet the bias is obvious. According to a 2014 study by two Indiana University professors, Reporters who identify as Democrats outnumber those who identify as Republicans by 4 to 1, 28% to 7%. The remaining 65% call themselves independent, but based on my long experience as a reporter, this is a fiction. That is, many reporters like to describe themselves as independent, but they're not. Not really. By any fair measure, this group is overwhelmingly on the political left. The obvious liberal bias has only served to push conservative readers to those sources that cater to conservative themes, further polarizing the media landscape. And unable to attract conservatives, the mainstream media have chosen to double down on views and themes that appeal to their liberal constituency. To give just one example, when Fox News broke a story in January 2016 about the discovery of top-secret intelligence on the private email server that Hillary Clinton used while Secretary of State, classified information which she had denied ever having sent or received, the New York Times buried this news story deep inside the paper. A decline in reporting standards, a decline in revenue, an increase in bias have made many wary of the people who provide them with their news. A certain amount of skepticism is a healthy thing, but a thriving democracy depends on a dynamic and free press. As much as people may like to bash the media, most people would far prefer to trust it. I'm Judith Miller, contributing editor of City Journal for Prager University.
Trust in the media is at an all-time low, and for good reason. We in the business of journalism have exempted ourselves from the normal rules that used to govern us, and so the most egregious kinds of reporting errors are becoming more common. Formerly well-respected news organizations and experienced national reporters are making the sorts of mistakes that wouldn't be tolerated in journalism school. When these mistakes are corrected at all, it's with seemingly little regret. And the corrections never get anywhere near as much attention as the original salacious but incorrect narrative. How do we get here? I discuss that in detail in my book, The Smear. Here are 3 factors. First, firewalls that once strictly separated news from opinion have been replaced by hopelessly blurred lines. Once forbidden practices such as editorializing within straight news reports and the inclusion of opinions as if fact are not only tolerated, they're encouraged. The result, it's never been harder for Americans to separate news that's real from news that's not. Example, May 14, 2016, 10 days after Donald Trump became the Republican presidential nominee, the New York Times published a blockbuster article titled, "Crossing the Line: How Donald Trump Behaved with Women in Private." The story's authors, Michael Barbaro and Megan Twohey, interviewed Roanne Lane, an ex-girlfriend of Trump's. Her quotes made Trump sound at best like a jerk and at worst like a predator. The reporters went so far as to provide their own quotes for the story, presenting their personal commentary as if it were established fact, writing, "This is the public treatment of some women by Mr. Trump. Degrading, impersonal, performed." The problem is the reporting wasn't true, according to Trump's supposed victim. Once the story was published, she publicly accused the Times of misleading her, writing a hit piece against Trump, and putting a negative connotation on what she said was not a negative experience. No matter where you stand, this was a huge development in terms of journalism. The main source behind front-page national news discredited the entire premise of the story. You'd expect something like that to rock the whole news organization and prompt investigations, a retraction, and re-examination of policies. Yet I can find no record of any of that. The Times and their reporters never even apologized or printed a correction. Second, though we may personally like or dislike a politician, as journalists we're obligated to treat them the same. Too often, that's not the case. For example, in May 2008, then-presidential candidate Barack Obama said he had visited 57 states. Since there are only 50 states, everyone knew what he meant. He meant to say that he had visited 47 states. The remark, nothing more than a verbal gaffe, drew little attention, and it didn't deserve more. But when Sarah Palin made a comparable gaffe saying, "We've got to stand with our North Korean allies," she was relentlessly ridiculed and mocked in the media, even though everyone knew she meant to say South Korean allies. Third, too many of us have allowed ourselves to become tools of politicians and spinmeisters, often in order to get something in return. I call this transactional journalism. Example, emails show in July 2009, the Atlantic reporter Mark Ambinder was promised a scoop. He'd get an advanced copy of a speech by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, but only if he followed certain conditions, as privately dictated by Clinton aide Philippe Rines. Rines emailed Ambinder precise instructions, including, "Describe Clinton's voice as muscular," and "Don't say you were blackmailed," by which Clinton aide Rines obviously meant, "Don't reveal our arrangement." "Got it," replied Ambinder. His resulting article reads in part, "When you think of President Obama's foreign policy, think of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. That's the message behind a muscular speech that Clinton is set to deliver today." That Ambinder, then considered a serious journalist, would allegedly violate basic ethics for such a minor story speaks volumes about the state of today's news media. For the record, Ambinder defended himself by saying that he found Clinton's speech to be muscular, so the adjective was appropriate. I think most Americans would like to believe their news is factual, well-researched, and untainted by a reporter's opinion. To put it another way, they want their news straight up. But too often now, that's not what they're getting, and they know it. I'm frequently asked, can the news be fixed? The answer is yes, but the first step to fixing a problem is admitting that we have one. Until we do that, nothing can change. I'm Cheryl Atkinson for Prager University.
The communist government of the former Soviet Union thought that by controlling access to information, they could keep their citizens in line. Consistent with the Orwellian nature of the Soviet Union, the country's most important newspaper was Pravda. Pravda is the Russian word for truth. But Pravda was not truth. It was full of lies. But here's the thing. Almost no one in the Soviet Union was fooled. They knew they were being lied to. Ironically, unlike most citizens in the Soviet Union, citizens in 21st century America are fooled by their news media. We think we're getting the real story from our major media, but we're not. When we tune into the networks or read the New York Times or the Washington Post, we're actually getting a sharply slanted version of the news, slanted to the left. This should deeply concern people on both sides of the political divide. To make informed decisions, a free society needs a press it can trust, not one that is hopelessly biased. In 2017, Project Veritas sent out undercover reporters to see how committed the major media was to objective news gathering, specifically as it regarded the newly elected president, Donald Trump. Our first report focused on CNN. A producer there, John Bonifield, acknowledged the lack of evidence for his network's efforts to link the Trump campaign and the Russian government in a plot to rig the 2016 election. Bonifield told us, "I think the president is probably right to say, look, you are witch hunting me. You have no smoking gun. You have no real proof." So why was CNN so relentless in hammering the Russia collusion narrative? Ideology, the election wasn't legitimate, and ratings. As Bonifield noted, the Trump-Russia collusion story was good for business. Next, we released another series of reports, these on the New York Times. First, we heard from Nick Dudick, the paper's audience strategy editor. Dudick told our undercover reporter he was responsible for choosing which New York Times videos go on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. Dudick boasted, "My imprint is on every video we do." And what was that imprint about? As Dudick, who worked on both the Obama and Hillary Clinton campaigns, told our reporter, he hoped to use his position to make the president's life as difficult as possible. "I will be objective," he told our reporter with undisguised sarcasm before revealing his true intentions. "No, I'm not. That's why I'm here. Dudek told us he returned to journalism precisely in order to remain politically active. Next, we met Des Shu, an editor for the paper. She made it clear where she stood. I think one of the things that maybe journalists were thinking about is like, oh, if we write about Trump and how insanely crazy he is and how ludicrous his policies are, then maybe people will read it and be like, oh wow, we shouldn't vote for him. According to the Times' own handbook on journalistic ethics, journalists may not do anything that damages the Times' reputation for strict neutrality in reporting on politics and government. So given such a breach of the Times' own standards, we expected the newspaper to come down hard on Dudek and Shu. Instead, they came down hard on us. Executive editor Dean Baquet said I was a despicable person for recording one of his employees telling the truth. Yet, when the Times publicized a 2012 undercover video of Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney saying that 47% of Americans wouldn't vote for him because they were dependent on the government, they praised it as offering a rare glimpse of Romney's personal views. In fact, in his attack on us, Baquet unwittingly gave the whole American media game away. A real journalist, he told a panel at the National Press Club, has to have in his or her heart a desire to make society better. The Times' editor is wrong. Real journalists want to pursue the truth. Then they let the citizens use that truth to build a better society. When journalists shape news to fit their vision of a better society, they're not doing their job. Perhaps this wouldn't be so bad if the major media would just admit their political motives. But they don't. On behalf of their own narrow agenda, they lie, distort, and exaggerate. And they expect us to call it Pravda. But with each passing day, fewer and fewer Americans are willing to do so. I'm James O'Keefe, founder and president of Project Veritas for Prager University.